Everybody enjoy the conference so far? Yay. So we're ending it up great. It's a great community. I love this. I love people who just enjoy making things, and that's what we're all about, right? It's wonderful. It feels kind of weird to be here. I mean, I don't know. I've tried to figure out how many talks I've given over the years. Hundreds, I think, right? I've been doing this for a long period of time. But the thing that's really kind of funny about all this is that essentially I'm an introvert, right? Anybody here feel like they're an introvert at all? Yeah, isn't that weird? It's kind of like, but still, we do all these things in the world. We interact with people. And I've just found myself almost accidentally ending up doing this kind of stuff, which is kind of weird to think about. I'm sure you all have heard of like the Myers-Briggs personality inventory and all that stuff. So there's a lot of criticism of this, like, oh, it changes over time and all these other things. And it's not fixed categories and stuff like that. But I remember taking that years ago and thinking, well, yeah, that really kind of has me. It kind of goes and it sort of explains who I am and everything. And there's stereotypes associated with all these different types of categorizations in Myers-Briggs. Like, for instance, you essentially have this lot right here, right? So that's extroverted, intuitive, thinking, perceptive. So they're at parties and such, right? You have this other group over here, INTJs, right? So introverted, intuitive, thinking, judgmental, right? That's a very funny thing, too, because I remember reading some of the early Myers-Briggs literature, and they said, it's really great that programming exists as a career because it's a place for all these people to hang out, right? And I don't know, I think that the industry's changed a bit since I first started reading about this, but I do notice that there's this thing of like, we like to have spirited fights about like, is dynamic typing better than static typing and this and that framework and this one. But it's all to good cause, right? It's all to good effect. We learn. We basically learn from each other and basically sort of hone our critical thinking skills, which is an extremely valuable thing for people that are doing critical design work, which is what we're all doing. Now, when I took this test ages ago, it kind of had me down as INTP, which is introverted, intuitive, thinking, perceptive. And it turns out that they have occasionally had conferences of INTP people, right? And essentially, they kind of look like that, right? Okay. Now, this is a jokey slide. It comes from the same place the other ones came from. But I did, years ago, look up and saw that there actually was like a convention of INTPs. And it's exactly what you'd expect. People sitting on couches, just kind of staring at each other, that kind of thing, right? So it's a very funny thing about this. It's like, what do you choose as a career if you're an INTP, right? And I had a hard time of that when I was younger. I was like, oh, what do I want to do with my life? And I think in high school, the thing that kind of settled on in the very beginning was, I'll become a pharmacist. Because I didn't really feel social at all. I felt like, people are problematic, right? So maybe I can just sort of like sit behind the counter, people come in their prescriptions, I get to mix things, I get to go and check things on the labels and do all these different things. And yeah, just like hand it out to people and just don't even have to look them in the eye, right? That's how shy I was at that time. So I never really kind of pursued that. It was like just one possible career avenue. What I did do from my middle high school years onward for a while was bag groceries, right? And that may not sound like a very thrilling, exciting job, but for an INTP, that's wonderful, right? It's like we'd bag the groceries, and I'd go out to the car with people, and I'd put the groceries in their car, and I could think about anything I wanted to all day long, right? So there is this thing with manual labor. It's like if you're introverted and you can just put your body on autopilot and do things, you can go off and, just sort of, let your mind run free and do various different things. Turns out that doesn't pay all that well, right? It's kind of a rough career choice. But when I started to really have dreams of what I wanted to do, the thing I was really utterly fascinated about, being like a very spatial, visual person, was architecture. And I thought, oh, this is incredible. I could be a designer of spaces and buildings and all this stuff. And that kind of like, it really resonated with my thing of understanding systems and understanding design and all these different things. So I started taking a few courses in college, and I remember the teacher was a great guy, but he was also kind of really rough on us in the sense that he kind of like kept trying to dissuade us from a career in architecture. He'd go and say, there are no minors in architecture. It's like you have to be into it, and I remember the first course I had was architectural rendering. We have to draw a building on campus, and I was taking the bus to the campus each day. I had this giant canvas, and I had to cover it with paper so the rain wouldn't get it, walk onto on the campus every day and sit there and draw the building and then take it back with me and stuff like this. And there was only one grade in the class. So I walked, into the guy's office, and he says, B+, just like that. And that was the grade in the class. I'm like, oh, this is really agonizing. Change major, right? And I ended up moving into mathematics because it's like, hey, abstract thought stuff and all this. But I felt in mathematics, it doesn't really impact people at all. And I felt like, I don't want to be off my own little dreamland for my entire career. So moved into engineering, and then progressively, I started to discover, programming. And programming is really cool because essentially it is about all these abstract spaces and basically forming computations in the air and rendering them. And the way that we structure code and systems means something. And it can be a very powerful way of changing the world and doing interesting things. And so it kind of resonated with me, kind of like architecture does, right? It just seemed like a very interesting thing. But I think the thing about programming that's most fascinating to me, it's not the programming itself, it's not the code itself, but the worldview that you have when you work on systems. You carry it off into other parts of your life, and you can. And it's fascinating for us. We know of Conway's Law, right? Everybody knows what Conway's Law is, right? And of course, here's the typical cartoon parody of Conway's Law. So it's like that's Amazon, got Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple. That was the Jobsian days of Apple, right? So their organizational structure was like Steve Jobs in the center, and everything's like a radial link from Steve Jobs because he walks in and says, oh, we're doing this. Boom. OK, we're doing that, right? But there is that thing. You can, and I don't know how much of this happens for many of you, but it's like if you're used to seeing the world in terms of systems, you see systems all over the place. And then you're kind of like, wow, if we nudge this one thing over here, what happens over there? And then you realize just how many design choices we have as human beings in the world. And it's a pretty powerful thing, right? So for me, as much as I hunker down and do hard work, software development's been a bit of an intellectual play space also, in the sense that you get to basically appreciate and work with hard problems all the time. And not all the hard problems are really technical. One of my favorite essays, I read this 2 years ago when it was put out, is this one right here. Have you ever heard of this at all? Mortality begins at 40, okay? It's really worthwhile, and I don't know, if you can handle things that are a little bit cynical, a little bit dark, this is the essay for you, right? And it's kind of fascinating. I'm in my 50s now. But he has this little frame that he goes and uses for people, basically going and saying that, gosh, how do I say this gently? He says that all culture is organized for people under 40. And essentially what happens is that in the culture, people are trying to sell to you, and you're trying to go and build a family, build a life, and all these other things, tackle hard problems in the world and all this stuff. But what happens is when you get to be about 40 or so, you begin to start to see some interesting things. You begin to see that the things that you thought were solved earlier weren't quite solved, and they kind of come back. And then you're kind of like, oh, what do we do now? And so you start seeing the cycles of time a little bit. And then, what you start to realize when you're about 40 or so, is that essentially people created for you these meaning games. They kind of sort of like set up society in such a way that you're just like, okay, here's a hard problem. Let's get everybody in their 20s to work on this. We'll get people to work on this stuff. And then when you get to be in your 40s, you're kind of like, oh, damn it. Now it's my job to do that, right? So what you do, if you're aware of this kind of thing, and it seems like you don't have to read the essay to be aware of this. You can, quite often it happens naturally in life for thoughtful people. You begin to realize that it's kind of like, yeah, that's kind of what happened. We were working in this space, and people discovered this was a bad problem. So let's go ahead and develop something that goes and solves that problem, right? And then you're marching along like that for a while, and then suddenly people are like, yeah, well, our solution wasn't all that great either. So the next generation gets to work on the solution to the solution. Engineering, isn't it wonderful? Right. But there's this long generational process that goes and happens across the industry. And so for me, it's been kind of fascinating because just the past couple of years, I'm starting to notice this now. It's like I'm starting to notice that some of the things I thought that we kind of put down in Agile, when I say put down, it's like putting down a dog, right? The things that we thought were like done are kind of like coming up again. So one of them is like documentation. So maybe I shouldn't take what I see on Twitter too seriously, right? But I remember seeing things a couple of years ago. It's like documentation is vital, and particularly now that we have distributed teams and everybody's working on their own, completely decentralized development. It's like, we must have people going and documenting everything, document every API, add more and more code comments to go and do these things. I'm kind of like, no, no. It's like I can see the desire and the initiative to do that sort of thing, but it's almost like, well, hey, we ran around for the past 20 years saying, don't do this. And now people are going back and saying, well, maybe we do need to do this. Now, is this a bug or a feature that we forget this stuff? It's a fascinating thing, isn't it? You might go and say, well, we'll never make any progress if the next generation goes and undoes what the previous generation does. But I think it's kind of like, it's like in any organic system, it's kind of like you have to have constant renewal, and that's what life is, right? We have new generations come along, and they basically go and look at the older generation and say, oh, you had your ideas, let's go and do. So you end up making the same mistakes over and over again a bit too, but you also end up going and making advances as well, because some things that we thought were hard early on turn out they're easier. Or maybe the context has changed in life and culture and all these things. And here's another one that just came up recently, or actually just in the past year or so. I'm seeing this thing of like, well, we've had open source and it's worked for ages, where basically people just volunteer time to work on things. But then suddenly people are saying now, it's like, oh, look at all the hard work I'm doing and nobody's paying me, right? And it is a real problem for people who invest a lot of time working in things. So they're trying to go and develop all these interesting payment models for people that work on open source. Sounds fine. I'm kind of amazed that we don't just call it proprietary anymore, right? But we have this thing, we marched in one direction for a while, and then now we're kind of like, oh, okay, that, we went too far, let's go ahead and do this other thing, right? So progress, change, the whole thing. So what have we done generationally now, right? This was influential to me, right? The Extreme Programming book, Kent Beck had a second edition, which was much lighter than the first edition in a way. And when I say lighter, I mean, just softer in a way. And some friends of mine just really prefer the first edition. People say this is the Old Testament versus the New Testament, right? It's kind of like, this is when he was like, oh, we must tear down the thing and build this new thing. And second edition is like, yeah, we did that, and it's like, some people got hurt. Let's go and make it softer and make it better and stuff like that, right? But as like a manifesto and kind of like, a way of going and saying, hey, let's go off and do something new and vital, it's pretty valuable. And for me, the thing that was kind of fascinating was, at that time, I worked in one of the most ridiculously extreme waterfall shops you ever would imagine, right? That thing of the waterfall process, it's not just a story. I worked for an FDA-regulated industry in Miami, Florida, and at a company, and we'd have 3-year product cycles, and the hardware would proceed first, and then software would kind of catch up and do things. We had lots of lead time. We actually used models in pre-UML notation, case tools, like we have a separate model for analysis, a separate one for design, a separate one for code generation. And in theory, we had the same concepts across them, but that meant sitting in these big, elaborate traceability meetings where people would say, well, we've got A over here. Oh, well, we've got A over here too. Hey, we've got A over here. Yay. Check that off. Move on to the next thing. But that's the way we developed software at that point in time. So when I met Kent at a conference and heard about some of these things, I started playing on my own. Eventually joined Uncle Bob's company, and we felt like we were on the start of this vast new thing, and we could basically find a better way of developing software. It turns out we did a lot of that, and I think that the entire industry has changed quite a bit as a result of doing those things. It's interesting to see what happened next, though. Okay, I still lament this at times. I get invited to speak at Agile conferences, and I'm kind of like, it's not this crowd, right? It's kind of like you have a lot of people in the room at Agile conferences that just have never really worked with code at all, right? They're not quite sure that it even exists. I mean, it's kind of like they know it exists, but they never really see it. So they look at the frame for software development problems as being totally about people and teams and process. And then I'm kind of like, yay, but Conway's law, and it's like, they look at you like, oh, whatever, right? It's like, yeah. It's all work product. It's all the features and that stuff. And then we end up having this thing where what we do is we start splitting out communities, right? We have domain-driven design community. We also have software craftsmanship. And it's kind of funny. So Pete McBreen basically wrote this book. God, I forget what year that was. But it was really kind of like, it was almost like the first XP book. It's like, here's a way of looking at the world. And then he kind of ran off and abandoned it for us. And so we've picked it up. We've made conferences. Bob Martin, Sandro, a bunch of people going and sort of like saying, hey, there's something here, there's an ethic around this, that we can basically go and consider the technical work vitally important and go and build a community around that kind of thing. So that's pretty cool, but I still feel unsatisfied. And maybe it's because I'm an introvert. I don't know. I ran into this book maybe about 2 months ago. It's kind of a strange book. Developer Hegemony. Now, does this seem, it's like, from the covers of the previous 2 books, you're kind of like, you didn't really have like any foreshadowing from the cover that basically some radical ideas would be presented, right? This one is totally like, oh, we've got to fist around the world, and we're using this really scary word hegemony and stuff like that, right? So I don't expect a lot of people in the industry to go and read this book. And frankly, the tone is a bit strange. I don't really particularly care for it all that much. But what I think is interesting is there's some ideas there that basically point to different ways of going and approaching software development. And I think it's really kind of worth going and talking about it. So I basically did a little bit of a screen capture from, in the first chapter, there's like an opening story of what life is like for an ideal life for a developer, or at least the author's vision of what development is like, right? And it starts going and casting some barbs, right? If you can kind of look at this, it's kind of like she's talking about her work situation. She's part of a small team of freelancers, and they're kind of like going and joking about Agile, right? Because it's kind of like, they just coordinate by phone when they need to go and do things. There's none of this thing of like, hey, we have a stand-up meeting, or all these other things that, what the author's trying to get across is, it's some ceremony, and maybe you don't need that. Maybe some people do, maybe some people don't. But he presents this frame which is kind of a little bit adversarial around these things. And yeah, it is kind of fascinating. So, this may put you right off, right? Like, look at the last sentence of this, okay? So, software development process has been designed to create the illusion of autonomy, right? Is that true? I see some smiles, right? I think that's the most interesting thing, and particularly in the world today, is that we can all see the same stuff, and we can all have different perspectives on that stuff. We can all look at it in different ways, and you can attribute malice in places where there's no malice or whatever. I do know that for myself, working in Agile software development as long as I have, sometimes I basically go to teams and there's like this sense of like, yeah, we're kind of going through the motions. We know we're doing Scrum. Hey, we know we're supposed to do this particular thing as part of Scrum. And so we do this thing because it's part of Scrum, right? And that's fine. And I always kind of hope that teams are really in this place of like, well, let's decide ourselves what we really need here, right? Maybe we don't need this particular piece. Maybe we need another piece, that kind of thing, right? Going and increasing the autonomy of the teams that happen to be doing the work. Now, the theory is, with a lot of Agile, that we do this already, but I don't know. I'd have to ask you, what's your work situation? It's like, do you really feel that you can kind of like drop a process element just to see what happens? Can you basically add new ones just to see what happens? I think we're getting way better in the industry about this, and I think that's great. But I do visit organizations quite often that have that same kind of tension there of like, we built this process, and it's kind of like, that's just what we do. We're not going to really push too hard on it. We'll just move along with it in a nice way. So one of the frames that Scott uses in his book, Developer Hegemony, is he basically goes and borrows something from an author who wrote this thing, the Gervais principle. You ever hear about this at all? It's basically a view of corporations through the frame of The Office, right? And so Gervais is Ricky Gervais. And essentially, it is a very cynical view of things. And you'll see I kind of crossed out in red what the original names were for the organizational layers that Ricky Gervais had mentioned: sociopaths, clueless, and losers, which is kind of ridiculous, right? But it's funny, because I'm not familiar with the UK version of The Office. Maybe you can map in your mind what this is. I remember, like, when I see the US version of it, you've got the people who kind of like make decisions kind of at the top. Then you've got Ricky Gervais's character, the manager, and he's like really keen on everything. It's like he wants to go and sort of like, we're all about the company goals and da-da-da-da. And then you have some people that are kind of just putting in the time, to go and actually, they'll do the work and everything like that, but they don't throw themselves fully behind the corporate initiative. They're kind of like, yeah, I kind of know I'm not going to become a manager at some point. Not even sure I want to be a manager. I'm just going to go and do the things, right? And so it is this frame for going to understand what happens inside of organizations. I do think that it is kind of funny, because it is really one of those like adversarial things in a way of going and saying, oh, okay, well, once you kind of see this, what do you do? Am I one of those people that, am I going to invest 30 years of my career at one particular company and sort of have so much ego investment in what I'm doing there that if I was laid off someday, that would be a problem, right? There's this funny thing. How far do we dig into the corporations that we're part of? How far do we identify with them? How far do we, is it just a job? Is it a way of approaching like a self-realization type thing? I think that's a question that we all have to kind of like ask ourselves, is essentially, who are we at work, right? What does our work mean for us, for the people around us, and all these kinds of things? And it's strange about this because for me, I spent a good deal of time working at this biomedical company until I was like 30-something. And then I started going and feeling like, for what I want to do in the industry, I'm not sure I'll be able to do it here. I want to basically visit different companies, see how they develop software, do all these kind of things. So I got very involved in some conversations on the internet. I started meeting people and talking to them. And eventually ended up meeting Bob Martin, right? And we had an interview. And I think the funny thing for me right then was I had a family and 2 kids and this kind of thing. We had this real brief conversation at one point. And I think he said something like, how do you feel about this? You've got a family and kids and stuff like that. The security of this. I'm kind of like, I said, well, yeah, there really isn't any such thing as security, really, right? The only security you have in life is the security you make. And he says, bingo. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I guess so. But there is this aspect of that essentially it's like, we do have to be in charge of our own careers. We do have to figure out what it is that we want in life. And quite often for some people that can mean staying in one place for a long period of time. For other people it can mean hopping from job to job and learning more and doing different things. For other people it can be the more radical thing of going and saying, I'm just going to visit corporations across the course of my life, visit different places, pollinate across these different places because I'm really interested in the craft of doing these things. So these are all choices we have to make, but it's great to make informed choices about all of them. The thing that's very interesting, though, and the place where that book, Developer Hegemony, kind of moves to, is this, that as developers, we can do a lot, right? It's like, we are able to make software. Software can be the foundation of a business. If we're not as introverted as I am, we can go out and basically market it. We can do all the other things that we need to go and do. We've never really had a time in human history where you can actually go and start developing things that have very widespread, okay? And do that as a one-person show or a 2- or 3-person show, that kind of thing. We can do that now. Now, it's really one of those things that's kind of like this, it's an interesting realization, but it's also like a path in life that's a little bit fraught with peril because essentially it's not the safe path. If you go out there on your own and you're making a startup or something, you can get into this place where, oh, no, it fails, and what do I do? Get another job, do that kind of thing, and stuff like that. What's striking to me, though, is that when we talk in the industry about various different things like Agile and all these process things that I kind of get involved in, is how many of those problems are really artificial in a way. What do I mean by artificial? Well, I don't have too many memories from when I was 3 years old, but I do remember the story that's been told to me as a teenager and an adult is that I ran into my parents' bedroom in the middle of the night when I was like 3 years old, and I said, Mommy, Daddy, my finger hurts when I go like this. What do you think the answer was? Don't go like that, right? So a lot of the things that we do with process and even scaling and stuff like this, how many of those, I think it's really worth for us thinking, how many of those are self-imposed problems, right? I've had this over and over again with the Agile community. It's like, Agile was a great way to go and get 6 to 12 people to work together to go and solve a problem. And then for close to 10 years, there became this thing of like, how do we get this to scale to big organizations? And I'm like, well, maybe it doesn't, right? And of course, there's some money to be made to go and make it scale in big organizations, and you can do good in that context and stuff like that. And now we have a variety of different frameworks to go and do that kind of thing. But it's never going to quite feel the same as what we had in the smaller scale. And I do really feel that, to the degree that we can, to the degree that we accept this challenge, we can choose to go and keep scale small in a lot of the things that we do, right? We can choose to go and have, you can do a vertical business, which doesn't really have to be more than a couple of people working together. And I know a couple of people are doing this sort of thing, where essentially it's, they don't have a plan to go and add headcount or to go and do this massive thing. And they're the founders aren't really looking for an exit at some point in time. They just want to have a sustainable business over the course of their life and not have to go and deal with the thing of like all the crazy things that happen when we start getting 20, 30, 100, 1,000 people in the context of your development organization. It's a lot of stuff, and if you like doing that kind of large stuff, great. If you don't have to, there's alternatives to that as well. So I do tend to feel that a lot of large development might possibly be in this realm, that we don't really get to fix large-scale development, and we keep trying, and that's great. But it's kind of like that thing of like, you pull on this one piece of string, something over here moves. You pull on another one, something over there moves. So it's a matter of like balancing forces. The more people you have involved, the bigger the system, all this other stuff. Some people love that challenge, and I'm saying, yeah, that's great. Sometimes you don't, right? What about coworkers? How do you feel about your coworkers? Somebody come up here and talk about how your coworkers feel. How you feel about your coworkers. Nobody's going to do it, right? You have tight-knit relationships with the people that you work with, right? And so you get into this thing where, sometimes people are doing very well, some people are not doing so well, stuff like this. I notice quite often in big corporations, there's a lot of work that doesn't quite have to happen. There's a lot of work that doesn't happen that should. And we all kind of like, we march along, we do things. On the other hand, I visited some very vital corporations where essentially people are just like, robustly digging in and doing the work they need to do, find new ways of doing things. And we all kind of hope for those environments in a way, don't we? Or not all of us, but many of us do. A thing I noticed early on, and never saw anybody comment upon, is how our industry is a little bit different from something like movie making, right? What's it like for people that are making movies? It's a big difference, and the big difference is this. It's like, generally it's union work, at least in the US, I'm pretty sure it is here as well. But you have this thing where you have highly technical people that are really good at doing something. They have to learn how to work well with others very well. Excuse me. Okay, you have to learn how to work well with everybody. And they do all this stuff. And I'm still amazed, as much as we do complicated work, the logistics involved in creating a movie are phenomenal, right? To have people here at this moment, here at that moment, have some people on hand, this equipment has to come here, it has to go away there. It's amazing that anything happens at all. I don't know that I've really visited a software team that goes and deals with that kind of pace and that kind of precision over the many years I've been consulting. But a funny thing about this, it's kind of like one of the things that's interesting about the movie industry is that essentially it's all kind of freelance in a way. There's like kind of this thing of like, well, you have to be really good at what you're doing, and you have to get along with the other people that you're working with well enough to be invited to the next gig. Because you're working on this movie, it's going to end, and then you move on to the next movie. It's a little bit different than what we have. Yeah, it's a little bit different than what we have. So, how do we cleverly avoid problems? I think one of the first things I kind of ran into somebody who was like doing this kind of thing was a guy named Anthony Eden. And I've met him at a conference. I haven't really dug into it too much with him. And I don't really know too much beyond those conversations I've had with him about what he does. But he has this company, DN Simple, right, doing basically DNS hosting and registration and stuff like that. My understanding is he moved to France, so he has his family over there, and it's really a small company dealing with all those things. And one of the interesting things is basically starting out as like a solo company, he tried to automate the hell out of everything he was doing because programmer, that's what you do, right? And he started noticing that thing, that difference between the thing of like doing very clean code versus doing the thing that's going to work because you have to move on to the next thing. And how, since he didn't have a boss, he had to make those trade-offs and sort of like be okay with them and understand when to take the shortcuts and when not to. And it's like that entire thing of like when it's all kind of on your shoulders, you have to make those decisions and you have to go and figure out what's good for you, going and doing that kind of thing. My understanding is, he was involved in the Ruby community early on. You'd see him speaking at conferences. He has the company, that kind of thing. I'm sure you're familiar with this guy too, Gojko Adzik. I actually met him here at CodeNode earlier in the year. Again, I see him periodically across time in the industry. But it's interesting. He's kind of like a small development space, but he writes books, he goes to conferences, he gets work going and consulting with different organizations and stuff like that. Real go-getter, and I'm really kind of fascinated with him. It's funny that we're sitting and we're meeting for coffee, and he goes and he hands me a copy of his book, and I've got it at home, and it's cool. but he just talks about how he has to go and take that break every once in a while and just go deep into the code and work on something. So he has like this mind mapping tool he's been doing for ages. But there's the thing of kind of like, well, I can make money off of this, but I can make money in the other way, and I wish I had more time to code this. But the thing of going and managing a small business is, a rather big deal. And it ends up being this kind of tension. If you're a person who got into this because you enjoy doing the development, you're going to deal with that tension all the time. Anybody know who this guy is at all? Yeah, it's probably before your generation, right? There's a guy named, his name is Robert Fripp. He was a guitarist back in the 1970s and 80s. And a very interesting character in the sense that he was part of a band called King Crimson. It was progressive rock back in the day. And they went through many different stylistic changes and everything. But around the time of the 80s or so, he decided he got really sick of the music industry, formed his own label, started going and teaching courses in something he called guitar craft, which has a connection with us in a way, right? It was all about digging in and becoming great at playing guitar and everything like that. And he had very strong opinions about things. But he basically exhibited this level of agency to go and actually just sort of say, look, this is the way I want to work in the world. And of course, it caused all these little troubles and problems, right? So, he had to go and deal with this thing of like, well, people trying to go and sort of like rip off his name, right? So people started selling special guitar picks based upon what they thought his guitar picks were. So he had to cease and desist them and all this other stuff too. But the thing that's really kind of fascinating is that when you read his writing from that period, you had that tension. And I think a lot of musicians have this tension all the time of like, you come into the work because you want to do the creative work. And that's great. But then essentially you find 70 to 80% of your time is really doing the management around the creative work. And entertainers, musicians, will deal with that in different ways. Quite often they'll find a business partner. They'll have a manager. So it's not a manager you work for, but someone you hire to manage your business. So you get to do the creative and they get to go and do more managerial, but those are rough. Partnerships can be kind of rough that way. So there's this constant tension then in all these things. But the thing is that there are other paths open for people that are really thinking about going in this particular direction. Another guy in the industry, Bas Vode, okay, everybody knows of him. He basically has a company or a series of companies, depending upon how you look at it, in Asia called Odd-E. And I think the first time, I'd known him from way back in the past. He invited me into a couple of corporations he worked with to do some consulting work. But someone who worked with him, a guy named Stanley in Singapore, he contacted me and says, hey, Mike, we want you to go and teach a course in Singapore. And I'm like, okay. So quote him a price, and we go back and forth about this and everything. And so I started noticing that quite often when I deal with people, they'll go and they'll say, wait a minute, I need to go and check this out. And then they'll come back and stuff like that. And he was just answering my questions immediately. And I'm kind of like, what's up here? Who's your boss? Who do you run these things past? And he's like, no, this is just my idea to have you come over. And so it's my initiative, and I'm doing it. And he does all the admin, as well as doing his consulting work with clients, and just decided to go and bring me in. So what it turns out is that essentially Odd-E is like this small series of companies incorporated in various different countries over there in Asia. And essentially they're extremely selective about who they hire in. And I'm not even sure it's an employment relationship. I'm not even sure how they structure that kind of thing. But they just basically set things up so that, they do the work and they just kind of, dig in and they just try to go and eliminate all the things that they think would go and get in the way of their work because they want to do the work. They want to basically have a little bit more control over their own destiny with things. They're not founders looking for a payout, after a couple of years. And they're also not people who basically feel like they want to go and build a huge organization because, you have to have a particular passion to go and build a huge organization, to want to go and do that. And it's cool because I think some people that love systems, are inclined that way. They're kind of like, yeah, it's like, I used to write code. Let me go and see if I can develop the next Facebook. Let's see if I can understand enough about culture and basically work with people to go and make highly functioning teams. And many people that make the transition well from software development, writing code, to becoming managers kind of go into that space of like, let me see this all as a big system. And others are kind of like, yeah, no, I'm just content to let me write the code. Let me go ahead and do the admin associated with it and do all these different things. So I kind of recommend that book, even though the tone might kind of throw you off a little bit. And because it kind of points at different things that are possible now within the software development industry. There is a bit of risk in going off and starting to do your own thing. But the thing is, if you are going to a corporation and you're kind of starting to dread work a bit, you have the choice. You can go to other corporations and stuff like that too. but there's other paths, and it's really worthwhile going and connecting with people that have taken these paths before, figuring out what works for you, doing the introspection to go and understand in yourself what works for you. And I think there's kind of like that secret knowledge that essentially it's like, when you can develop software, you can do a lot. You can do a lot of stuff. So I guess the closing thing to go and sort of say is that you don't have to be unhappy at work, but you do have to work, right? So it's like, that's the thing. And there are all these different possibilities throughout there. So it's really worth going and digging in and figuring those things out. So I guess I'll open it up to questions then. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Questions/comments.
When you decided to go as a contractor, how did you get the first gig?
When I decided to go as a contractor, how did I decide to get the first gig? I don't think I really would have done this without going and meeting Bob, honestly. And I think a lot of that was I knew I wanted to. It looked like he already had the connections, to go and actually do this well within the industry, and already had a company that was there. So actually, see, that's an interesting thing, because I kind of think that when I joined Bob, I was independent, even though I worked with him, right? We had this very interesting arrangement within the company. He would say, well, we're probably going to be 2 weeks on with client, the other 2 weeks, do whatever you need to do to be good in the industry, right? But it was actually years later that I did go independent, and it was really more about, I think by that time I'd written the book that I wrote, the Legacy Code book, and so I'd had people coming up to me. But I have to, it's weird. I feel weird standing up here and saying, hey, here's a path, because it can be a hard path. And I think that I had a couple of things that kind of like really tipped in my favor pretty well to do this sort of thing. But one thing that's kind of interesting in life is that if you set in your mind that that maybe you want to be in a different situation, you start looking around and seeing different things, making contact with different people, looking at different opportunities, putting yourself in the position to actually get your first contract. Being at conferences, you meet people and you see other people and you're kind of like, I'm interested in that. And maybe you get to work with a couple of people that are doing, contracts together, things along those lines. So there are these kind of possibilities. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
One more.
I'm kind of in the interesting position where I've kind of started off contracting and then gone the other way towards being permanent. And I guess my take on things at the moment is if you join the right organization, there are often a lot of possibilities within that organization. Mm-hmm. You also have to be in the right place and be in the right team and have the right support. So yeah, that is. But there's a lot you can do in the right organization, and maybe even if you want to go, contracting or independent, you could still fit yourself out for that in the right organization by being strategic about the path within that organization.
Yeah, very, very true. And there are people I know that just love working in big organizations. They're fine with it. They know how to maneuver through them and do the interesting things. One of the things that's kind of funny is that when I visit companies, I don't quite get to say the thing that I say sometimes when I speak at, like, say, a university, which is like, your first work situation, that's not the way all work situations are. You got to move around. You got to kind of, if you can, basically work for a couple of different companies, because culture within companies can be wildly different. And quite often, I'll encounter people that just go from university into a place and stay there 5, 6 years, and they just have no idea. That some of the things that they think are problematic don't exist in other places. Might be other problematic things, but, there's a lot of variety out there. So, yeah. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.